so-called liberalism and its discontents, an attempt at a new examination of the variation in the pattern of regimes called liberalism. We have, it seems to me, a gross and enormous error of argument in Fukuyama, who bases his continuing argument primarily on the notion of voting with one's feet as a metaphor for international migration. The problem with the argument is that liberalism is the only regime that actually advertises itself as primarily existing in order to treat all people as indiscriminately the same. In other words, to ignore their values. All the other systems. So my point here is that if the system is actually saying, give us your tired and huddled masses, give us everyone, that's the only system in the world that's advertising for the disaffected or the ambitious people of every other country. No other variation in the pattern of regimes is making that offer. So it stands as obvious that, of course, they're going to, the liberal countries are going to get a lot more people for the thing they're actually advertising for and saying, come and do. Whereas the other countries say, it's hard to say this from the logic of the West itself and liberalism itself. We can superimpose the abstract idea of the distinction between values and facts on the other countries and say the other countries have special requirements for the values which are not the same as the liberal requirement to ignore the values as much as possible. If you have very particular values, or remember, this is a weak way of putting it. If you put it from the point of view from within Japan, for instance, how Japanese see themselves, you can't even state it that way, and you get something more deeply encased and hard to wedge out and really see what it's all about. But I think, for instance, of the fact that in Japan, Caucasians born in Japan, raised in Japan with Japanese educations, are not granted Japanese citizenship. They're not advertising for come and join us. It's not part of their thing. So so I think this Fukuyama and also it's basically the CIA argument. Come join the club is the CIA phrase. Welcome. You're welcome into the club. That's your standard. That's not the standard of every other culture on Earth. So it doesn't make sense. And we could see there is migration to every country on Earth, in fact. So there's some people that they might be very peculiar people that say, I want to go live in Uzbekistan or someplace, and there is immigration to almost every country on Earth. Some countries forbid immigration. probably Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Maybe not. Maybe they're very wealthy. They'll let you become a citizen. I'm not sure about that. But okay, at the same time, we see this is a one way to orient ourselves towards the question, what is liberalism? It's a system that has the value of distinguishing society from government, and is saying society is where values happen and government is where the facts happen. More early, the fact value distinction is more recent than liberalism. Earlier on, one would have had to analyze it according to something like social contract theory or something like that. Separating the sphere of society from the sphere of government is one of the manners of defining classical liberalism. I think in the form of classical liberalism, when we understand it as a kind of laissez-faire, the problem is it's not really freedom. What it is any such question implies assert that there was education that you got before you were old enough to make any decisions. Somebody else forced that education on you. So, for example, I give an example to show that this is one. It's a very recent feature because of the rapidity in which the curriculum and the goal of education changes in our own time, at least since after World War II. So in the 60s, under Mao, there's spontaneous movement of this first generation to be given a Maoist education. Nobody told them to do it. They formed the Red Guard. They went out. They were searching for monsters that they knew were very close, shoulder to shoulder with them, called nationalists, meaning the Chiang Kai-shek nationalists, who were in sympathy with the Taiwanese government. And this was clearly the result of the normal education that everyone in that country had. So the idea of this separation of freedom to choose, and that the sunlight is the best disinfectant and infectant and so on, is a false dichotomy. This notion of that there's either freedom or tyranny, or the issue is totally concealed by the fact that education comes before we have any plausible autonomy or competency in making judgments. So we're told how to think long before we have the possibility in any serious sense to make an informed choice. You can't ask the child, do you want to learn how to read? This is forced. Now, there could be a question of how far education could be parsed back to the bare minimum, where everything learned is like a technique, like learning how to read and write, rather than having any so-called value content. That's a difficult question, but it would again be very peculiar to the liberal system, of the distinction between facts and values being pushed to the hilt. So I think in this general, let's just take a 40,000 foot view for a second and look at it from remember Max Nordau somehow put this reflection together with what's just said against Fukuyama and the CIA's argument about voting with your feet. So Nordau came out with his book on degeneration, or Entartung, the thing that later became famous with the Nazis, prior to the Dreyfus affair. So he was already, this is the independent idea. It's not having to do with either Zionism, nationalism, his desire to say the people that look the same should be the jury and judge of the people that look the same. But it's a totally independent idea. It's the idea that the standards of civilization, rather than the standards of a nation or a culture, the standards of civilization are being revolted against. So you see this in a kind of phenomenological, schizophrenic sense in the Here Hegel died, as we've often mentioned, in the Balzac, The Unknown Masterpiece, where the painter paints this work that nobody else can understand, can perceive properly, knows how to understand. Think of Rothko or so, or Giamicatti, the Italian skinny sculptor, and so on. This idea in Nordau is more like a Van Gogh or something like that. So remember, Van Gogh went against already there had been a generation going against the academic painting schools, the Parisian painting schools. That was known before Van Gogh. The revolt against the academies. But Van Gogh and Gauguin and so on took it further. That's interesting if you think about it. Gauguin was a very successful bourgeois, not a man who would go to war, a man of all the bourgeois trappings, exoticism of the islands. That's a taste of his that survived even after he gave up his successful bourgeois life. But nonetheless, to go more in the direction of what they call bohemianism, a third choice rather than right or left. So this third choice, rather than progress or saying everything, it strikes me also, by the way, as preposterous, this kind of right or left notion understood in a real life by the theoretical standard Leo Strauss gives. He gives it as a theoretical standard for orienting our understanding, saying we can understand conservative as that which considers the current situation sufficient and therefore wants to conserve it. But that's obviously never, an actual political person never considers everything sufficient or perfect. There's always changes they want to make in some respects, and maybe very radical changes. Drain the swamp, etc. So that orientation can never be taken straightforwardly, but it's just an orientation. But against these two notions of the being more for change, or maybe we could orient it and say both change for the better and change for the better about the things that are the most essential. The one that's more saying the things that are the most essential need to be changed is the progressive or the leftist. And then the ones that are saying more the things that are closest to us and most essential are sufficient and should be conserved. But then there's another choice, the bohemian choice, and this corresponds to what Nordau is damning in general. So we could say even though Van Gogh didn't live so much a high life, but he was bohemian in the sense of drinking that absinthe, that green drink, and it was more into like Munch and Strindberg and so on. In this sense, bohemian. This is basically the direction that Nordau was putting down as the degenerate. Remember the Nazi degenerate art stuff. Then he becomes. Remember, there's another guy, Herzl, who is a much more kind of level-headed and so on at the beginning of the Zionist movement after the Dreyfus Affair reveals then supposedly the error in liberalism. So what's the point of, why does the Dreyfus Affair reveal undisclosed the true character of liberalism? Supposedly because it can't even fulfill its promise to have a region called society where everyone is treated by the law rather than by some extra legal standard such as race. It can't even fulfill that promise. But see, once we get into the discussion of whether it can fulfill its promises or not, we've already forgotten that the liberalism is just one variation, the newest variation on the pattern of regime in general. We allow it to have so much power that we don't notice that it's one regime amongst others. It presents itself in the light of a triumphalist or Whig absolute idea.